Thanks, Mel. It's great to see everybody here today. Thanks for making it out. Bronwen and I have been involved in a project called Polaris since about 2020. And we've been coming to Dillingham and engaging with folks here. And we're finally at a point in the project where we have findings to report back to you all. So we're really excited to be at that point. I'm Megan. I'm at Emory University. I'm an environmental scientist there. I have a background in botany and plant science, but also social science. So I do work on the land with plants, but I also talk to people and understand how they interact with the land and plants. And a lot of the work that we're presenting today is us talking to people and building them. Bronwen, do you want to say more about yourself?
So I'm Bronwen. I'm at Penn State in geography, and my background is in nutrition and food systems, but more and more I'm a social scientist because I'm really interested in learning from people about what constrains what they eat, what shapes what they eat. And here in Dillingham, I'll talk about a paper I'm working on the supports and barriers to subsistence practice. Megan's going to start.
So we're both food people, so that's kind of what connects us, and the stuff we talked about today is good. So as I mentioned, this work that we're doing is part of a larger project. So we're just two people in a project that's probably 20 to 30 people. And these are some of the things that the larger project is working on. We're looking at disruptions to infrastructure, environmental hazards. Chris Mayo is doing that work out of UAF. You may have seen him working with folks here on community coastal erosion monitoring. There's people that are working on environmental change in food security and nutrition, and we're part of that kind of aspect of the project. And then there's people also looking at how climate change is impacting people's decisions where they want to live. If they want to live in Dillingham, if they want to move to a different community, impacts on mobility. Today, in this presentation, we're going to talk about our particular interests and foci within the Polaris project. Bronwen's been working on talking to folks about assets and barriers related to subsistence, doing subsistence on the landscape, harvesting subsistence foods, and processing and eating those foods. I've been talking to a lot of home gardeners and thinking about how home gardening is being integrated into broader food systems in the area, broader values around subsistence or traditional food systems. And I've also been doing work related to berry stewardship and care. And Bronwen and I work closely together, so this is collective work that we're presenting today, but we have particular leadership kind of capacity on each of these points. We've been coming to Dillingham since 2020. We each visited the community 4 years during that time. We often come once a year. We've been able to talk to about 50 people over that time. People that are home gardeners, people that pick berries, people that are hunting, marine mammals, terrestrial mammals, a whole range of different people to understand our kind of key points and how that works within food systems and environments in Dillingham. We've also engaged with larger data collection efforts. We've been working with DDNA closely and the Alaska Department of Fish and Game Subsistence Division to do a number of household surveys. You might have received those surveys. And we've been asking questions about subsistence harvest. We've been asking questions about whether people garden or not, the types of foods that people eat, a whole host of a range of questions. This project was also approved by the Chiriang Tribal Council at the beginning of the project. We continue to be advised by folks at BBNA and through that have the opportunity to check in with the Tribal Council throughout the progression of this project. And before we kind of get into our results, we wanted to acknowledge a number of people and acknowledge the community at large. Every time we come here, we feel very welcome. People are so friendly, they're willing to talk to us, and it's been such a wonderful place to work. So we thank you for having us and hosting us every time we come. A big thank you to Dagan. He's been a gracious host of many of our questions, showing us his garden, sharing food with us every time that we come. And he's been a lot of inspiration for the gardening work that I've done. So thank you, Dagan. Helen, Adderman, and Cassandra, we've been working a lot with berries. other folks at BBNA like Cody, Renee, Ted, as well as Gayla have been helping us along the way, as well as APFMG. So a big acknowledgement to all those folks. And I'll hand it over to Bronwen.
All right, so there's quite a bit of emerging evidence in Alaska that subsistence foods are really important to people's health and nutrition here. And I didn't want to try and replicate that. There's also work that's trying to understand why people are or aren't able to practice subsistence harvesting. Certainly, there's quite a bit of work published around how environmental change is impacting people's subsistence practices. But there hasn't been a lot of work that looks at the social and the ecological drivers of whether people are able to continue practicing subsistence harvesting. And so after having spoken with lots of folks in the community around sort of what would be of interest, I settled on asking questions about that. In this paper, we are including 42 interviews with folks here in Dillingham. The interviews were recorded, and then we're going through and looking for the themes that come out, really letting the community members' words speak for themselves in terms of what the barriers are or aren't. It's qualitative research, so it's not driven by a hypothesis that we're trying to test. We're really looking to see what the community says about what the barriers and supports are. So first, importantly, subsistence, obviously, you all know this is really important still in Dillingham. But a lot of things need to fall into place for somebody to practice subsistence. You need enough time. You need to be physically able to do the work of subsistence. Subsistence work isn't easy. You need to feel safe. You need money to pay for gas. You need transportation. You need equipment, and you need knowledge about where the berries are, or where the fish are, and how to process, etc. And many community members talk about how this is made possible because they're going out on somebody else's boat, or they have a berry picking partner that helps them feel safe out on the landscape. And that this collective practicing with other community members helps support people to continue practicing subsistence. And of course, the maintenance of traditional social cultural practices and values and knowledge is another really key aspect of why many community members in this community are able to continue practicing subsistence harvesting. Certainly, there's a lot of work being done to make sure that can continue to happen. Families are working really hard. It's really clear in talking to community members that families are working hard to teach their young people how to practice subsistence, but also the values around subsistence, not taking too much, sharing your food, the value of hard work, being responsible in your practice, being proud of traditional foods. A lot of young parents talk about making sure they're exposing their kids to traditional foods at an early age so that they learn to enjoy the taste of seal oil or the taste of berries, etc. There's also a lot of work being done at the community level. I'm not Alaskan. This project is my first time working in Alaska, and it's really impressive how hard so many different organizations in the community are working to make sure that that practice continues, and to make sure that all community members are able to practice as much as each individual is able. So things like subsistence leave, which is not available to everybody in the community, but at least a portion of the community. Cultural camps, 4-H and plant clubs and subsistence clubs are really helping to support this continued practice in Dillingham. Dillingham is also a little bit unique, maybe not that unique, but for Alaska, but some really key aspects of this issue in Dillingham is that, like other rural communities, there's a lot of mobility here. There's an influx of people into this rural community, both from outside the state, but also from smaller communities, smaller native communities moving into Dillingham. And many people from Dillingham travel, move outside, come back, they go for work, they go for education, they come back. And even historically, traditional communities would have moved around to access different subsistence resources at different times in the year. So it's not really surprising then that somebody from Mucioki is going home to Mucioki to practice their subsistence there. That sort of mobility has long been part of making sure people have access to subsistence resources. The other unique thing that was a bit more surprising in Dillingham is that people do express constraint to access to land to practice subsistence on. Pretty much everybody we talked to talked about not wanting everybody to know where they pick their berries, talked about a little bit of concern about getting to their berry patch and finding that somebody had already picked it, and like more broadly talking about concern for those resources and wanting to make sure that things aren't over harvested to ensure the longevity of those resources, and not just berries, also fish, also moose, right? I understand it's not so easy to get a moose right close by to Dillingham, and so there definitely is pressure. And then the other key thing about Dillingham is that even though it's a rural community per Alaska regulation, a lot of the land that people have access to if they're on foot or even walking from the road is privately owned or tribally owned, and then that's not necessarily a place where everybody can practice subsistence. And so that really highlights how important having access to transportation is, right? The folks that can get in an airplane and fly to harvest are privileged and have great access. The folks who don't have a car are very constrained, right? And so that comes to the part of this paper about who doesn't feel able to practice subsistence, right? Well, a lot of people in Dillingham feel they are able to practice subsistence, but there are people in this community who would like better access, better engagement with subsistence. And the really important thing in looking at how people talk about these barriers is that it's never just one thing. It's when they all line up together. You don't have a car, that's overcomeable, go with the friend. But then you have a job and you can't get leave from your job at the same time that your friend wants to go, then that's another layer of barrier. Maybe you can get leave, maybe you don't have a job, you need childcare, you need to find childcare at the same time that your friend is free. So these barriers, when they stack on top of each other, then that's when people face barriers. And so I'm hopeful that this finding from this work can be helpful to policymakers and community and people who are planning work, engaging with the ongoing work to try and help get people who aren't engaged in subsistence out doing subsistence, that just sort of paying attention to the ways these barriers stack on top of each other and compound each other will help policymakers think about how to continue to support community members. The other really key finding is that social networks are so important, because so many people are practicing subsistence with others, whether it's because you need to go on your buddy's boat, or whether it's because you need a friend to go berry picking with because you don't feel safe, right? Like the number of people who express sadness about not having enough berry picking partners or having lost a berry picking partner, and how that impacts how often people go out and how safe people feel on the landscape was really a clear thing that came out of so many of our discussions. And so the other key thing is that of those people who have those multiple barriers, so many of them, the folks that say they can't get out and practice subsistence as much as they would like, it's in part because of damaged or insufficient social network here in Dillingham, right? Folks who've just moved here from a small community, they don't know anybody with a boat, they don't know where to go, they don't know where to go. How do they access, how do they participate, right? How do they learn if they don't have a social network to support them the way folks who are from Dillingham have. And equally, you know, the teachers and doctors that are coming in, they also need social network to figure out how to be on the land and where they are allowed to be on the land. And you know, somebody who's here for a couple of years, maybe they could afford to buy a boat, but do they want to buy a boat? They're not sure how long they're going to be here. And then finally, there's lots of people in this community who either have a social network that's been damaged because of past difficulties in life, difficult periods in life, or their social network doesn't include people who want to also practice subsistence. And so it's very clear that that process of rebuilding building a new part of your social network with folks who will also support you to go berry picking for folks, like especially Native folks who have not been practicing that want to get out, how, I mean, you, the community, the policymakers, how to support people to rebuild those social networks, I think is a key thing to think about. But you can tell me at the end if this is an accurate issue. And yeah, so this paper is not yet written, but it's in process, and I'm looking forward to feedback after Megan's done. Go ahead, Megan.
So the second topic of our presentation is related to gardening, and some of you may have gotten the handout today. This is a paper that I've been working on, I guess, for 3 years, and it has been published, and it's like a peer-reviewed journal article, which means it's been evaluated by other researchers in terms of quality and content, and communities often find these articles useful in terms of advocacy and sharing about their community with policymakers and other people that have kind of say or overlooking decisions within the community. So this is an open access article. I'll also post it on Facebook and people can share it as they wish. Yeah, but this work was kind of inspired by curiosity about gardening here in Dillingham and about gardening in Alaska and in communities where food sovereignty and food security is a top priority, and in communities that have other types of foods that they highly depend on, such as subsistence, wild or traditional foods. I was really interested in, you know, how many people garden, how this type of food system, which isn't traditional if you're Alaska Native, but is becoming increasingly popular among Indigenous communities throughout the US and Alaska, is being integrated into traditional food systems or subsistence food systems, which often hold different values. I did 30 interviews with home gardeners in Dillingham, and I did 13 interviews with other individuals throughout Alaska to kind of compare trends that are happening and to understand if this is something that is happening throughout the state and kind of the values and the priorities related to that. I also included questions on a survey that was done by BBNA and ADF&G, simply asking people in Dillingham if they gardened or not, if they were interested in gardening or not, and having the opportunity to then look at that question in relationship to a whole host of other questions related to subsistence food use and household characteristics. That survey included 155 households that completed the survey in Dillingham, and 65% of the surveyed individuals were Alaska Native households or had Alaska Native household head. So from that 155 people that were households that were surveyed, we found that 42% of those households kept a home garden in Dillingham. And on average, people were keeping a home garden for almost 12 years. But this ranged from people that had 50 years of gardening experience, highly experienced gardeners, to people that were new, 1 year of gardening experience. Of the people who did not garden, over half were interested in starting a garden. So I was actually really surprised by the rate of gardening in Dillingham and by the rate of people that were interested in starting gardens but hadn't done that yet. If you've got the paper, you'll see this table in the paper, and I'm not going to go over every single item here today, but you can see if you're interested in different variables or different household characteristics by people that garden and do not garden, or the collective sample, you can look more in detail in the paper in that table. But some things that I wanted to point out. So households that garden are economically better off than households that do not garden in the general average household in Dillingham. So those that did garden earned about $30,000 more per year than households that did not garden, which I think reflects, if you are a gardener in Dillingham, it's expensive to ship in soil, even ship in little light pots. It's an investment, and you have to have money to invest in that. We found that for those that got households that didn't have an Alaska Native household had gardened at a higher rate, but households that had an Alaska Native household were more had higher rates of interest in gardening. But through the interviews, suggested that there were different barriers, such as time, splitting their time between other types of food gathering or food subsistence food use and gardening, resources and costs, experience, rather than just interest. So there are other barriers rather than they didn't want to garden. That was not the case. And in fact, of the households that indicated they were interested in gardening, which I said about half of households were, 66% of those were Alaska Native households. It was interesting to see that people that gardened also harvested higher amounts of subsistence or traditional foods. So gardening households in Dillingham harvest more total pounds per capita of subsistence foods, so 244 pounds, than non-gardening households, which on average were harvesting about 175 pounds. And gardening households harvested more than the average household in Dillingham, so about 40 pounds more per capita. This was also the case in terms of diversity between wild subsistence or wild foods types. So gardening households were harvesting more types of wild foods, so salmon, berries, land mammals, etc. And they were also harvesting a greater diversity within those types. So they were harvesting more different types of berries or more different types of fish than people that didn't garden. Overlap here, so you can't read that quite. But what it's saying is that this emphasizes that a lot of people are able to balance different types of food provisioning. So they're doing subsistence at a high level, but they're also spending time doing gardening. That's one of my questions was, in terms of time balancing, is that an issue? But overall, it seems like for most households, that's not. These are some quotes from different interview respondents. This person said, it's a quality of life that is just hard to beat if you're eating that well from the land and also from what you can produce locally. A lot of people talked about different crops that they were producing. As you know, potatoes do particularly well here and are a popular crop for growing. And people talked about kind of the ease of growing potatoes in terms of putting potatoes in the ground, going fishing, coming back, the potatoes are ready. You still have potatoes, they're pretty low maintenance. So that was a crop that particularly you could balance different resources and time and still be able to accomplish a diversity of food provisioning. Gardeners are really proud of the food that they're growing, and it's a great source of pride and joy. It seems, overall, if you live in Alaska, if you live in Dillingham, you like to be outdoors, you like to be on the land, you're an outdoor person. And people were saying, at the end of a long winter, before you can get out onto the landscape and do particular things, you can start gardening inside your home or inside, your greenhouse. And this kind of mentally gives you a jump start into spring, starting to feel connected to the land again, starting to kind of shake off those winter doldrums. And mentally, you know, it's an important part of people's well-being. Another important aspect of gardening I found was sharing. So gardening households engage not only in more harvesting of these foods, but they also engage in more giving of wild or subsistence foods in occurrence and again in diversity than households that did not garden. So for example, 83% of gardeners gave salmon to other households compared to 65% of households that did not garden. 58% gave large land mammals compared to 46% of households that did not garden. But in terms of receiving foods, gardeners and non-gardeners generally received wild or subsistence foods at similar rates. For the interviews, when I was looking at themes that people talked about across the interviews, sharing food, sharing equipment, sharing seeds, starts was really one of the most common themes. So 32 out of the 42 interviews that I conducted mentioned sharing of different things, and this was sharing was mentioned 87 times across all interviews. This person said, I give it all away. That's the value to my family. There was another person that talked about that they didn't garden because they didn't have anybody to share it with. So they were worried that they would, you know, be producing food that they couldn't eat themselves and they didn't have somebody to share. So that was kind of something that they didn't want to take that on unless they had the network to share it with. I was finding that gardening knowledge networks were similar to community or family networks that you find that are connected to subsistence food related knowledge, where they're traveling through families and generations, and gardening connects people to their grandmother or their great grandmother through that knowledge, through, you know, that activity, through having seeds or starts, perennial starts that came from people before you. And respondents often talked about gardens of their great grandparents or grandparents and the decline that happened in the 1960s, and not necessarily getting this knowledge from their parents, but from generations that happened before their parents. This is a graph that's also in the paper, and it shows in detail the different rates of sharing and receiving of subsistence foods by households that garden, do not garden, in the overall sample of the 150 households that were surveyed through the household survey. And lastly, gardeners have an affinity for plants. So if you are a gardener, you're good with plants, or you hope to be good with plants. And I think this really came out in the fact that 95% of gardeners harvested wild berries. This is really high compared to 66% of households that did not garden. So, you know, people that did not garden, 66% of them harvested wild berries. And the overall rate in Dillingham, that's giving, sorry. 70% of gardeners gave wild berries to other people compared to 46% of households that did not garden gave wild berries. So gardeners are harvesting a lot of berries and they're giving lots of berries to other people. Gardeners harvested an average of 19 pounds of wild plants or berries. That's quite high. And they also were transplanting wild plants into their gardens. So we are seeing things like lovage, beach green sorrel that were particularly of interest to have better access to, and they were putting those in their garden. So some big picture takeaways that came up from this work. I think overall I'm hearing from people that garden foods is desired within the community to really negotiate greater autonomy over food systems, greater choice, greater quality of fresh fruits and vegetables that are maybe somewhat more affordable than what you're getting in the food in the store. There's this fusion of cuisines and recipes that's happening with gardening different types of crops or fruits and vegetables, and people were saying like they like to try new things, they like to experiment with new things because then they have the opportunity to eat a greater diversity than what's offered in the store. And they have the opportunity to be creative in terms of what they're cooking and integrating between subsistence and garden food systems or market food systems. And that's really exciting and enjoyable. You may have heard of super households in terms of subsistence food systems, which means there's households within the community that harvest a lot of subsistence foods, and they're responsible for sharing those foods and supporting the community at large with subsistence foods. But I'm finding that that also transfers over to gardeners. So we're seeing that gardeners are high producers of all types of foods, and they're responsible for supporting their community with not only garden foods, but also subsistence foods. Also starts, which was an important resource that not everybody can produce depending on what you have in terms of being able to produce starts for your garden. So super gardeners are really important resources within the gardener community and really important resources of food overall for the community. I was finding that, when you think of the term gardener or farmer, not everybody identifies with that. But they might enjoy producing food, they might enjoy being a provider for their community. And I felt that the roles of gardening weren't kind of they weren't adapted by everybody, but there were the means of being a good relative or being a good community with food as a large component of those roles that really people identified with at large throughout, being a gardener, being a food producer. And then lastly, shifting the bar of success away from yield-based outcomes. So, being a gardener doesn't mean that you'll produce a lot of food, but you can get a lot of other values and health and well-being benefits from gardening. So shifting the outcomes from like how much did you get to the outcomes of family and community that are inherent to food sovereignty and the intangible values that are related to gardening beyond the quantity or volume that comes out of it. And at the end, I wanted to briefly just talk about something else that I'm working on. It's not published, it's not ready to share entirely, but I mentioned that I'm a plant person. And that's what drew me a bit to gardening, but it draws me a lot to working with berries and plants. And it was exciting to see that 95% of gardeners are berry harvesters. So while I was talking to gardeners, I was also talking to berry pickers. And I'm really interested in how people care for berries on the landscape, how people interact with plants and steward plants to produce sustainable, healthy environments and berry communities, but also supporting the well-being of their community that are consume berries as a really important cultural and nutritional resource. So I was, talking to people also about berries, about how they connect with berries on the landscape, steward vegetation or manage vegetation, how these practices support sustainability of cultural foods and berries, and how these stewardship practices kind of vary among different landscapes. So I work in Alaska, but I also work in different places, which kind of gives me an interesting perspective on what people do broadly in relation to plants. So just a snippet of what I'm finding. Among the people that I talked to, people identified 31 different practices of berry stewardship. And these were widely variable. So out of those practices, 22 of the practices were mentioned by 1 to 5 people, which means they're pretty family dependent. A lot of these aren't practiced widely. The 5 most common practices discussed were transplanting or seeding berry plants, which I brought up a lot, so that could have, a little bit biased that result, but a lot of people were talking about moving around berry plants or reseeding berry plants as a type of reciprocity when they're picking berries. Whether you do transplanting successfully or not, that's another thing, because some of these berry plants are hard to move around. But it's something that people are thinking about in terms of access and response to some of the climate impacts that berries are experiencing. The second most common practice mentioned was traveling over the tundra in a careful manner and picking in a careful manner. So, staying on ATV tracks, watching where you're stepping. One person described picking berries as like combing a child's hair, like being very careful about how you're handling those plants. You're not ripping a bunch of leaves off. Not picking all the berries, only taking what you need, not overfilling your freezer was talked about by 15 people. Being careful when you're using a berry picker or not using it at all. That was a common topic of discussion, as well as being mindful of others in the land while you're picking. So thinking about where you're going, thinking about, if you're a young person and you're strong, maybe you want to go further so you can leave closer berries for other people. And then thinking about maybe other people will come here too, so leaving some for other people. And that paper is to be continued, so I'll have more of an update on that later, but we hope to use this time to hear from you now on Bronwen subsistence food use, feedback on the gardening paper, thoughts about berry stewardship, just sharing your experiences, or future work that we might build on in Dillingham. Anything that you feel like talking about, we invite discussion.
Talking about berries and moving plants. Are you in contact? I can't remember his last name. I think it's Josh with the cooperative extension up in Palmer area. I've been following him. He's doing fascinating work with native berries, and it's just, I'm amazed what he can do. And in case we start having problems, he might be somebody that'll have some ways to help out. So
yeah, I do follow him on Facebook, and I've seen him talk at a conference, and I agree his work is just really amazing, and I'd love to learn more about what he's doing with the starts. I haven't heard that far, but it sounds like maybe he's going to give them to communities and such.
I was kind of
amazed he can do anything.
I read that too. I was like, really, people are transplanting berry plants?
They're
moving
talking
around?
about it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, not a lot of people said they had very much success.
Yeah, some people like high bush cranberries. One person did move currants, but the tundra bee species are not, haven't been successful. Raspberries.
You might regret moving on to cranberries. And then something that I'm struggling with hugely is, and I worry that I might have brought it on myself, is we have these damn slugs now, and I think they might have come in some of this soil from other places, but it's been ruining my garden the last couple of years, just horrendously.
Yeah.
So it's really, I'm almost not gardening so bad. So bringing in pest species of either critters or plants is a concern to me, especially if you're bringing starts in. What's in the soil? What other stuff's there?
Yeah, slugs have taken over the town. It's not just your fault, Dan.
David, do you have slugs?
Man, it is discouraging when even your potato plants are just nothing but the ribs and the leaves.
I chuckle a little bit because I do follow a website, Alaska Gardening Rebels. Started off small, over 5,000 now. And one of the biggest things was slugs and stuff like that. And I've written a few articles on why I believe I don't have slugs. And there's a number of reasons I'll talk to you about that, but slugs are not an issue in my garden, and everybody around me are slug pests. I'm serious, and there's reasons I believe that I don't have slugs.
Give me one or two.
Immaculate garden. There's no food for the slugs.
Yeah.
I pick the leaves up, aerates down there. I don't throw the compost or anything right in the garden. I plant certain plants around the perimeter. They love kale, they like broccoli and stuff, that's in the middle of the garden. I weed whack all the way down around 6 to 8 feet around the outside perimeter, so I create a desert atmosphere for them. And I've been working at this for years, and I'll tell you what, I don't have slugs. I do, little teeny ones once in a while, and I look at them and who was there? Maybe you guys or somebody, and I grabbed one up and I looked at it and I said, look at that, cute, little ones. My other friend, his slugs are that big and no vegetables, no, it looked like somebody shot everything with buckshot, you know, and I understand, I mean, that's what I do. But I'm one of those, get down on my knees and crawl in the garden in the evening and nobody around, I have KDLG played. That may be it, KDLG. But
Works for bears, right?
And Fred knows, he's been in my garden. You know, he knows a lot of people come there and say, well, how do you do it, Dagan? Actually, there was a picture back there showed my garden, and you'll see there's no weeds or anything. Oh, chickweed. A lot of people ask me about chickweed. And I say, I don't have chickweed because I have a weeding process, and I've written these things up and published them. See, there's my garden. There's no weeds and no slugs.
Looks beautiful.
And it looks unhealthy to a lot of people. They think you're supposed to have all of your vegetable cuttings from your household thrown in there and everything thrown down. And I had friends who went in there and they laid cardboard in their garden so they could crawl around and weed their garden. And the slugs went underneath, yep. And they had them that long, and the eggs looked like herring roe underneath there. It was so bad. And we actually filled up a pickup truck with the cardboard full of slugs and eggs, and we took them out and we dumped them in the dump. So if you could live close to the dump, well, I'm sorry. That's where they went, you know. But it's just it amazed me, and to this day, I'm still amazed that I don't have that massive problem. But you go to a place just close by me and they have massive slug problems. That's the difference. So
Yeah, nice big flat area to do that.
My garden too, I was talking to Dagan the last couple of years too, and I do, as Brittany said, I've been breaking off all the lower branches on mine. I've always kept a clean garden, but I used to take my lawn and I would put my lawn as a mulch, and it just warmed the soil, and I had just very wonderful crops. But when the slugs came to this town, they loved that, and so I can't practice that anymore. So,
but
so you have to change your gardening style.
Yeah, I can't put down the weed barrier stuff because I was finding out that's where they hide all day.
they love it, yeah.
So,
Because they're just like a big piece of snot. You know, right up there.
I haven't been starting, I've had in years, because I've been vigilant. When they first came, they ate everything.
I've been trying to follow
my
your
mom
advice.
came over and said, I've never seen a slug. I said, well, there's none in my garden, but I'm gonna show you some. And I walked over by my trailer where my skip was on, and I walked over and I was looking for a piece of wood on the ground, and I said, hey. So the chalk on my trailer, 2x6 piece, went down there and I picked it up, and there they were. They're all around. It's just that, not my garden, okay?
Yeah.
I've been plucking some of those up, and I got a pile of sample jars, and I'm in charge with Joseph Slawicki or something like that, also up in Palmer, and sending him slugs for genetic samples, and so far there's nothing unique. They're common gray garden slug, and there's a newer one showed up that's a lot tougher. I actually go around with this very Leatherman, I'm cutting them in half and I find them out there in the garden, but there's some that don't cut too easy, and you gotta go really saw on them, they're tough. So, and I haven't heard back from him. I only sent him a couple of samples this year, but I think they're different. When I first started gardening, there was these itty bitty black slugs that would get in the crease of the cabbage stem and leaf, and they didn't do anything. Then those brown ones, and you got like Joan over there walks with my wife, and one time certain conditions, and it was our, at the time, dirt road. They were just coming out like worse than a plague of locusts out on it. It was gross. The road was dang near slippery with them. And just snot.
You probably have a lot of nightmares.
I heard of slugs.
Yeah, so,
Well, I'll mention something that maybe everybody can weigh in on. Our growing season has definitely gotten longer.
it seemed damn short this year. It was so dang cold.
I don't know, it starts earlier and when was the first frost was later, and yeah.
Mid-July.
I if you look back over 20, 30 years, I think the growing season's got longer. Yes, no?
No, well, mine has, because I got grow lights. I start early in the spring. But it varies a little bit in the fall. It does fluctuate, but this was the longest I kept potatoes in the ground. And boy, I had nice skins on my potatoes. I like that.
Hard to get consensus on that question. I asked people a little bit about that, and it's kind of, the recall is difficult, and they'll talk about like the most recent year to look at long-term data.
Well, we got pretty dramatic differences in microclimates too. Like in my yard, it's kind of on a slope down to the creek. And when I first started my garden, I got the idea in late or mid-July. And so I started digging up some tundra and taking trees out. I was finding ice under this far under moss at the lowest spots the first week of August on a hot summer. So I ended up getting some temperature sensors, and I had one up near my house halfway down and then down in the garden, and they let them run all summer and downloaded them. And there was like a 2 or 3 degree difference average in 100 feet or less than 100 feet. So Dagan's got great exposure. You guys got pretty good exposure.
The trees are growing pretty big.
Yeah, I keep chopping branches back so the light can get back on them.
Yeah.
But the last 2 summers have been so cold, my production, I barely got my seed back on potatoes this year.
Okay.
And that one time I was growing close to 140 pounds a year. And it was so wet, the water table came up and I was having some seepage out of my septic system. I had to abandon a big chunk of my, that was pretty discouraging.
Well, Denise would know, I'm thinking back decades ago where nothing went in the ground until second week of June, and now she's putting them in late May. So.
At least the seeds and stuff.
And then if you look at the ice out at Lake Lickniget, it's about 9 days earlier than the historical average. So it's just, I think the data is there to prove it no matter what our bad memories say.
I think overall I'd agree with you. It's just like this, I salvaged some garden because it ran so late this fall. It finally warmed up mid or late July. But my carrots never got over this. And between the rabbits and the slugs on charred, that was it. So.
Well, every year's different.
Yep.
It is. And see,
Dramatic.
like this year, I planted later than I ever did before. My sister-in-law next door, she planted early. Man, she had some awesome potatoes. And I'm trying to compare, we're what, a few 100 feet apart. Well, mine was a little different setting of this, evening sun more. But I found out some, and it dawned on me, and I was talking to her about it. My rows along the hill are like this. But we had so much water that sometimes I had water in between my rows, and it didn't dawn on me until I was reading an article about a month ago. It says, potato, they don't like a lot of water. And I go, shit, I was drowning them, And her, up where she was at, she didn't have that problem at all. And hers were much bigger. And it's a difference between, in the last 3 years, it was 400 some 1 pound 3 years ago. 2 years ago, it was 326 pounds. And this year I had 353 pounds, exactly the same 5 rows, exactly the same potato starts. per bag. I count them, I label them, do that, and it makes a big difference in there. Now, I had the quantity, but not the poundage, I mean, the same number of potatoes, but they weren't big. And I document them all because I used to grow 12 varieties, I only do 9 now. And I enjoy it. I enjoy it. And I give them away if you need potatoes. As Ted knows, he's been on my, but I do that because I grew up doing it with my grandmother as a child. And I don't know, I'm addicted to it.
Well, there's something common about being out in the garden.
Oh, it is.
And you see a gardener in the spring digging and I was like talking, what are you doing? What are you doing? You know?
I still got to learn how to do onions like you. I got 5 onions this year.
Well, we,
Walla Sweets.
and we aired this year, Mark cut the tops off of them. And now you know that you pick them and you let them dry before, and because they're starting to grow in the bag, so you live and learn.
And
But one thing that I grew this year in the last year is I've gone back to northern Michigan where my daughter's living, and this lady has a garlic farm. And a garlic farm.
Oh,
And so I bought garlic seeds. And the last couple of years, I have a spot and I've grown some beautiful garlic from, she's had it in Upper Michigan for, her family's had it for years and years and years, and they now have a business. And I've grown garlic at least this big, which is
juicy.
really nice. So that's a new addition to my garden.
Do you
does
plant
that
them
really
in the
keep the
fall?
vampires away?
Mark's still there.
Denise, do you plant the garlic?
We
in the
got enough to
fall?
sell you
It's
some.
in there, yeah. It's
Yeah,
in
that's
there.
just, I just kept wrapping my head around, I have a girl I knew from college gardening in Anchorage, and she's planting her garlic now.
Mhm.
Same thing with shrubs, and I just can't wrap my head around it, you plant them just before winter, huh? But I guess that's what it's done, so.
The ADF and G data say that subsistence food offtake has been stable for a while in Dillingham without too much decline. Do you all perceive that as well, or do you perceive a change in how many people are practicing subsistence here?
But I have a different question besides gardening is, this year there were no high bush blueberries. Is that, like, I was just, did anybody get blueberries or huckleberries?
Blueberry, not the,
Yeah.
what we call it.
So,
Couldn't find that.
yeah.
And they were abundant up in Tanana
Mhm.
and over in Anchorage, up in the hillside. It's just the weather is
They
a
look
big
great in
factor.
Pennsylvania.
But if you notice, I've never seen every berry flourish in one given summer. There's some that
Right.
would flourish and some that would flourish. It just depends on that weather. And so I think Mother Nature provides us bad weather berries and good weather berries and at different seasons, I mean, you're not gonna get them all. So put up enough to last you 2 years and you will never be out.
Well, and this year as well, the bogberry, the little cranberries that are out in the bog,
Uh-huh.
I couldn't find them. That's my
No.
favorite berry. I couldn't find any this year. And it was wet. So I would presume there'd have been a lot. There weren't.
I think it depends a little bit on when they're flowering and the pollination and
Yeah.
but all I did was get high bush this year, but the salmon berries looked really good when I was out. To not ignore your question, those of us that love caribou
Oh, yeah,
terribly miss the ready access we had to caribou for a while.
yeah.
Uh,
And the moose population's just not big enough to replace the caribou that were here.
No,
Oh, yeah.
when the caribou were abundant, so.
Yeah, moose have replaced caribou. Back in the 80s, it was very hard to find a moose. Everybody hunted caribou. Now everybody hunts moose. Have been for decades.
I like caribou hunting better, they're smaller, easier to
Yeah.
deal with.
Just letting you know I'm interested in gardening and looking for that.
Oh, cool.
You want a garden here or in Bethel?
In Bethel.
Oh,
What's that, Myers Farm?
oh,
Do you know the guy Myers Farm there in Bethel?
Yeah,
Okay. He's the pro up there. Send stuff down here. I
There
guess.
was one thing on here I noticed tonight, let's give it a thought. They talked about having to go farther out and because of travel and this and that, and I was going back and remembering my grandma coming home, she was born in 1900, she'd have 2 buckets there and her bold legs like that, she was an avid berry picker and everything. But she'd walk from her house, which is right above the post office, she'd go out different places. That's what we did. We didn't have all the vehicles. We didn't have all that stuff. And it was all around the local marshes and hills or whatever like that. And the same with a lot of the other subsistence stuff. Seems like there's less, like our king salmon, you know, different things like that. Well, there weren't many people in the villages up in the river system, very few, and all the villages around. The populations have exploded, they've gotten big, and the impact on all of that is significant. And Mother Nature doesn't go out and plant extra berries for the extra people, you know? I mean, it just doesn't work that way. And the fish aren't gonna spawn twice as much eggs, you know? It's just the way it is. So we've gotta look at it, and I think population growth of the human being is the demise of our subsistence harvest and stuff like that. So therefore, we need to buy seeds and plant gardens if you want to survive.
Agriculture,
Huh?
agriculture.
Yeah. Well, if you fly over here and just like any of the other villages, you see ATV trails like a spider web everywhere. People are trashing the tundra to go out and get those berries that are further out, or just because they don't have those strong bow legs.
Both the subsistence harvester and those out there for hunting and for enjoying getting out and about. And you could see these 6-wheelers and everything. And so people with money are buying all this big stuff. And you know, look at Wasilla. If you really walk out there into the Susitna, and you get out there and it's like rust, so it looks like a wagon train, you know, trails and stuff all over the place, and it's mucky. And it's
Same with a lot of the villages, and people don't recognize the damage they're doing.
Oh, yeah.
They just, and then they, you know, they tear it up, and then they go around it and tear it up and go around it, and that.
You're right, and like, name a place, Levelock had roads built, you know, with gravel. But everybody took the shortcut across pristine low bush cranberry country, and they had trails going between to take the shortcut, and they wiped them out. Amazing. So, yeah, we do to ourselves, you know, I mean,
The whole planet there, not just here.
Right. I find the statistic of 40% of people gardening way high. I don't see that in our community. Do you? Do you see that percentage being that high?
So, yeah, go make an answer. Answer for your paper.
Yeah, that's interesting. Of the 155 people interviewed, that's the case.
Wow.
But
But it might be that the types of folks who agree to do the ADF&G
Same.
survey
Okay.
are the types of folks that are interested in
That makes more
subsistence and gardening.
I know of at least 2 people this year that built raised beds. And I was gonna bring up the soil issue, what we have for soil here. We ended up giving away compost to our neighbors because they wanted to build some raised beds, but it's so hard to get soil. And our soil is terrible. We want to get it right underneath the tundra, at 3-4 inches maybe, if you're lucky. But we've been composting for a long time. And we had more soil than we knew what to do with. And our construction crew had to build 2 more raised beds this year to deal with the compost soil.
Geez, I'll take some off your hands. My compost doesn't generate that well.
I just built another like 6 by 20 foot long raised bed. So
Something else affecting subsistence is that there was a period of time, I think when I first got here, that salmon fishing had been really lucrative. And people would, I would see them charter an airplane and fly over to where the blackberries are really thick. And they'd pick, and prices on stuff has gone way up. We've had some pretty bum fishing years, so people can't range as far. They go, how much gas can I afford to go
Yeah.
moose hunting? I can't afford a four-wheeler.
Yeah,
Stuff like that has been another, because there was a time where, boom, they were thinking up things to do with money, and off they went.
yeah. The last paper I hope to write for this project is about the push-pull. Like, is it push that subsistence is too hard, or is it pull that the store-bought food's easy or easier? And how do
the
those,
answer is yes.
like, right, and when does subsistence food become too hard or too costly relative to store-bought food? And we did some math, and it's like, it cost out the cost per pound of moose, and compare it to the cost of hamburger in the store. Right now, moose is cheaper, but if gas gets much more expensive, that scale is gonna.
Yeah, I don't know.
A lot of this, my moose season, because my outboard broke, so I bought a brand new one, and I probably would money ahead to just go buy meat. Expensive as hell.
Yeah.
So, but in like Dagan's grandma and many other grandmas that were so tough. I think of Mary Olympic, some of the older ladies
Yep.
I know, they were so tough. And they just went and got it, whatever it took to do it. And it, yeah, it's part of their soul. They had to go do it.
Denise, he's saying they don't make them like they used to.
I'm trying to be careful.
Back in the day, we had Justice Sense, who grew starts,
Yeah.
and then Ray Bell took over,
Uh-huh.
and Keith Erkey did some of it too. We
Oh,
don't have
yeah.
anybody that does
Nobody's doing starts, yeah.
anymore, so it makes gardening a little bit harder to get it. I start my own, but not everybody has the room to do that, so it's becoming more challenging because we don't have somebody start doing starts. Tony will do some,
You lost part of your social network.
yeah.
Well, I don't want to import anymore after seeing the damn
Mhm.
slugs.
However, Amazon will send plants.
Yeah.
Yes, you can get
Outdoor-
strawberry plants, they just will send them. I mean, your loss is kind of high, but it's better than nothing.
I did 42 flats in my living room. Gordy didn't have no starts, came to my house. He needed nasturtiums too and stuff, and I looked at him and said, well, you know, you could do starts in your living room, and he says, my wife wouldn't let me, and I said, that's one of the drawbacks of being married. I had 42 flats, that's, 36 in a flat,
Yeah.
1,400 some, I think it was, starts, and I gave them away to people that needed them. I've never sold a potato or a start, never have, never will, because that's the day I quit. It's just, I do it because I enjoy it.
Before you all run away, as part of that push-pull paper, beyond understanding how much stuff people get in terms of subsistence, to understand push-pull, I have a little question about what people are actually eating. If any of you would be interested in filling it out, one per household, I would be grateful.